everyone to the 2020 Quaker Theological Discussion Group, known as the acronym, the tongue twister acronym, QTDG. Try to say that quickly. And the theme this year is Quaker Pastoral Theology and Vocational Ministry. My name is Carole Spencer, and I co-chair this group with Christy Randazzo. Christy is hosting the session. There's Christy, along with Cherie Spock, who is also helping out with the technology. Today's session is, what is a Quaker pastoral theology, and how is it enfleshed and embodied in a community? So originally our meeting was to be held in Boston in conjunction with the American Academy of Religion, who we've been meeting with annually for many years, but of course, due to the pandemic, everything was moved online. So while not having the joy of meeting in person, we do have the unexpected opportunity to have many more participants who otherwise would not have been able to travel to Boston. So welcome everyone, wherever you are. It's very exciting to be able to offer this distinguished panel to so many people all over the country and the world. I'm sure there's many folks here who have probably never attended a QTDG session, perhaps some who didn't even know we existed. So I'd like to just say a few words about who we are. For the newcomers in the group, we have a long history. We actually have been around since 1957. And the QTDG was established as a forum for discussing theological issues and open to all who were willing to enter into dialogue with friends of all persuasions. And while it hasn't been able to bring unity to friends, it has been a place of respectful and civil dialogue and has played, I think, a unique role in increasing understanding and respect among all of our branches. So this Zoom format is really a wonderful way to expand our purpose and our mission, which is to quote from our inception in 1957. Our purpose is to explore the meaning and implications of our Quaker faith and religious experience through discussion and publication. And our journal, that I would say is our publishing arm, is the Quaker Religious Thought, which has been so ably edited by John Kirshner the last few years. And most of the presentations that have been done at the sessions end up as articles in the journal. And our panelists will all be writing up summaries of their presentations, and they'll be published in the journal. So before I introduce the panelists, just a few maybe instructions and explanations. In the past, when we were a smaller group, and I mean a smaller group like a dozen or two, we would have everyone introduce themselves, but with this many folks, that's going to be impossible, so we have to skip that piece. Please mute yourself if you're not muted. Only the person speaking on the panel will be unmuted at the time, so we don't have background noise. If you have questions for the presenters, you can type them into the chat box at the end after all the panelists have presented. If you haven't done it before, you can see there's a feature at the bottom of the screen called chat, and you just click on that and you can type in your question. And Christy will be kind of curating the questions. We probably can't answer every one, and he'll send the questions then to me and I will ask the question. Our session will be about 2.5 hours. So each panelist has 20 minutes to speak. And I've got the Grinch-like task of being the timekeeper. So I may have to interrupt you if you go over your time limit and let you know it's time to wrap up. So you might want to, time yourself as you speak. We do want to have a half hour at the end for Q&A. So try to keep the panelists keep your presentations to 20 minutes. This session is being recorded. we've asked in advance and everyone seemed to be okay with that. That would make the sessions available just to people who have registered for this presentation, maybe couldn't attend at the end. So that being said, unless there are any other questions or anything you want to add, Christy, I'll introduce the panelists. Okay, all right, we're ready to go. So we have with us this morning, this afternoon, or this evening, depending on where you are, we have Ashley M. Wilcox, who is the author of the Women's Lectionary. Could you spotlight Ashley for us? You can find her among this group. Oh, there's Paul. Well, while he's looking for Ashley, I'll just tell you about her. She is the author of the Women's Lectionary, Preaching the Women of the Bible Throughout the Year. There she is. Hi, Ash. She is, it's going to be out soon from Westminster John Knox Press. Ashley is the founder of the Church of Mary Magdalene, who very much deserves to have a church. Thank you, Ashley. Ashley is a graduate of Candler School of Theology and Willamette University of Law. She teaches preaching at Candler School of Theology. Her online class is called Preaching with Confidence. Her writing has been published in Friend's Journal, Western Friend, and a number of Quaker anthologies, as well as on her website, ashleywilcox.com. Our next presenter is C. Wess Daniels. We can spotlight Wess. Wess is an author, hi Wess, educator and theologian living with his family in Greensboro, North Carolina, formerly from Camas, Washington. He has a PhD from Fuller Theological Seminary. He's director of the Friends Center and Quaker Studies at Guilford College. His publications include A Convergent Model of Renewal, Remixing the Quaker Tradition in a Participatory Culture, and Resisting Empire, the Book of Revelation as Resistance. His weekly newsletter, Resisting Empire, Remixing Faith, is available at gatheringlight.com. Oscar Lugusa is a member of the Religious Society of Friends in Vihiga yearly meeting in Kenya. He holds an MA from Earlham School of Religion. Nice to see you, Oscar. So glad you could join us. He's a doctoral student at University of Birmingham. That's in England, not Alabama. He teaches at Friends Theological College in Kamosi, Kenya. He's contributed to Quakers in Africa in the Cambridge Companion to Quaker Studies, and has written The Concept of Hierarchy and Doing Ministry in the Church, Evaluating the Roles of Teachers and the Use of Authority in Quakerism, which was published last year in Quaker Religious Thought. Derek Brown is Vice President of Distance Learning at Berkeley College. Hi, Derek. Where he also serves as Dean of the School of Graduate Studies. His PhD from Johnson University explores Kansas Yearly Meeting's adoption of the pastoral system. His first book on Quakers and pastors provides a practical outline of a friend's pastoral ethos. And he's currently working on a monograph for the Brill Research Perspective in Quaker Studies series. Derek is married to his college sweetheart, Jessica, and has twin daughters. And our last panelist is Phil Baisley. Phil is the author of The Same But Different, Ministry and the Quaker Pastor, which just came out last year. So nice to see you, Phil. He's professor of pastoral ministry at Earlham School of Religion. He lives outside Richmond, Indiana on the PB&J Ranch with his family and a menagerie of horses, dogs, cats, snakes, lizards, turtles, spiders, and McGee the mini mule. Phil's memoir of growing up in the 1950s and 60s in Brooklyn is available in episode form at www.philbaisley.com. Tales of a Canarsie Boy. And his current project is a crime novel set in 1904. So as you can see, we have panelists with a wide range of interests and publications. And we're really excited to hear what you have to bring to us today. So I think without further ado, we will begin with Ashley Wilcox.
Thank you, Carole, for that introduction. And thanks to everyone who organized this event, especially Christy and Charisse. It's good to see so many friendly faces in this Zoom. So today I'm going to talk about pastoral care as community care and how we can use community care to try to prevent burnout in our ministers. But before I launch into that, I'd like to take a few minutes for worship, and I will speak out of that worship. So please join me. Pastors wear a lot of hats. Pastors' roles include preacher, worship leader, provider of pastoral care, counselor, teacher, administrator, and those are just the official expectations. As Barbara Brown Taylor says, a pastor also ends up being a social worker, a chauffeur, a cook, a financial advisor, a community organizer, babysitter, philanthropist, marriage counselor, cheerleader, and friend. And in a church with a large staff, those roles may be divided among several people. But then the lead pastor also has to manage several employees. And in a church with a solo pastor, the pastor either has to do all of these tasks or rely on a strong lay leadership. I've listed here many roles of the pastor, but I'm going to focus on two today. And those two that are primary tasks for any pastor are preaching or leading worship and pastoral care. It's fundamental to the pastoral role to be able to provide these two things, to deliver a message and to take care of those in the community in need. But these two things, preaching and pastoral care, have completely different skill sets and require different gifts, and they don't always go together. Pastors tend to be better at one or the other, and it's important for the community to fill those gaps. Because otherwise the community will suffer because they're not getting what they need from the church, or the pastor will suffer because they are spending a lot of time on something that they're not gifted in or skilled at or equipped to provide, or both. In my own work and ministry, I usually focus on the first part, preaching and vocal ministry. But here today, I'm going to look more at pastoral care and specifically how Quakers are providing pastoral care for each other. Pastoral care is most powerful when it involves communities of care, rather than expecting one person to take on all of the pastoral care for the community. In communities of care, a pastor is one person among many who care for the congregation. And communities of care bring together everyone, the pastor, other people in the meeting or the church, to offer ministries of care to each other and to those outside their congregation. So what do I mean when I talk about pastoral care? This includes caring for members' spiritual, emotional, and physical needs, which are often connected to each other. For example, a member may feel far from God, or that God is distant after the loss of a job, or the death of a family member, or in the midst of a medical crisis. A person in the community may have a sense of anxiety, a spiritual anxiety that's connected to the anxiety of rising student loan payments. And so in a community of care, the people providing pastoral care ask spiritual questions, as well as questions about what's going on in a person's life, physically, emotionally, and financially. And so this is one of the places where Quakers have developed a structure that responds to the different gifts in the community, a place that we've done well, because instead of expecting the same person or even a group of people to take on both vocal ministry and pastoral care, Quakers have recognized that individuals may feel called to be ministers or elders. Ministers traditionally give vocal ministry and other forms of outward witness, and elders are those who feel led to support the spiritual needs of the community as a whole. And we've formalized this separation in committees, often called ministry and worship, or care and counsel, or other names. And so this is true of both programmed and unprogrammed friends, and it's one of our strengths as Quakers. One example that I found as I was preparing for this of a community that's doing excellent pastoral care, community care, is First Friends Meeting in Richmond, Indiana. They have a program called the Care Team, which began in 1989. And they started this because the pastor at the time made hospital calls, but didn't make many visits to the members who were homebound, and they had several homebound members. And so the Ministry and Oversight Committee expressed a concern, and the pastor encouraged them to develop a visitation group whose members would regularly contact the homebound. This care team has been ongoing since then, providing meals, shopping assistance, transportation, and doing odd jobs. And the care team also likes to provide something special around the holidays, like a luncheon for people in assisted living, or sending Easter baskets to share with people in a retirement community. So this is how their care team works. Each person on the care team chooses one or two people from the homebound list that they would like to contact at least once a month. They also have a coordinating team, which meets monthly to discuss special needs in the community. Each person on the care team sends their contacts to the clerk of the coordinating committee. And this clerk puts the contacts into a table to see who's gotten contacts and who they need to reach out to. There are no terms for the people on this care team. They just stay as long as they feel called to the work. And the pastor may or may not be on this care team. This is true community pastoral care for each other. Their most recent pastor was, but it's not necessarily a requirement. So I spoke with the clerk of the care team, and she said that their responsibilities expanded greatly this year. They care for those who are homebound, and that now includes basically everyone in their community. And the care team hasn't been able to do their visits in person due to COVID-19, but they continue regular phone calls and cards and being connected and helping each other. And this is a way to keep people connected in the community, especially people who don't do Zoom, people who might just need a phone call or a card, some connection. And the care team has regular workshops and trainings for people on the team, including a recent workshop on compassion fatigue, which I think a lot of us could use right now. So far, I've been talking about ways that Friends have done pastoral care well, but there are definitely areas in which we could improve. And one of those is to be sure to name the gift of pastoral care. Unfortunately, some Friends are wary of naming this gift, and there are a variety of reasons for this. Some Friends feel uncomfortable publicly recognizing or acknowledging any kind of gift. It's not just pastoral care. Others specifically don't like the sound of pastoral care as a gift because it seems tied up in the pastoral system, which they're not a part of. Or Friends may think in terms of talents or skills instead of gifts. And so all of these results in Friends not naming the gift of pastoral care. But this lack of naming of this gift creates problems for Friends. First, it fails to recognize that God has given the gift to the community, not to the individual who holds it. And so this can isolate the person who feels called to pastoral care. Second, it can disconnect those with the gift of pastoral care from the places that they can use it in the meeting. If the meeting sees a care and counsel committee as slots to be filled, those slots may be filled by anyone, not just those with a particular gift. And the people who feel this gift or this calling might be left out. And I've found that this results in secret pastors in meetings. These people who are doing pastoral care and pastoral work, but aren't recognized. And some of these people are lovely and doing wonderful work, but they don't have the support and accountability of the community as they do this work. And this denies them the guidance that they could have through prayer, mentorship, or training, these workshops that I talked about. Just think how much stronger our meetings would be and how much we would benefit by naming and nurturing this gift of pastoral care where we see it. I started by listing many of the different roles that pastors are expected to fill. And one of the consequences of all these expectations, and we see this all over the country in different denominations, is widespread clergy burnout. This is a real problem right now. I read an article by Anne Helen Peterson describing this burnout. She wrote it for her newsletter called "The Contours of Clergy Burnout." She says that it's a combination of feeling a calling with massive student debt, the stress of social media, unlivable wages, and the pressure to work all the time at one job while also making time for a second job to buoy you financially. She includes firsthand accounts from faith leaders in various denominations and religions sharing how this path is burning them out. So I recommend that to you. Anne Helen Peterson, The Contours of Clergy Burnout. Friends are not immune to ministry burnout. I've been in public ministry for over a decade now among Friends, and I have seen some of my closest friends burn out and leave Friends altogether. And this is another reason that it is important to separate the roles of minister and elder. Ministers are in need of pastoral care. Ministers and pastors have all the same stresses and concerns as everyone else in the community: spiritual, financial, emotional, and physical, especially this year. And we need to talk about debt. Many ministers have high student loans and credit card debt, which they're expected to manage on their own and never talk about. So if there are others in the community with this gift of pastoral care, they can check in on the minister and see how the ministers are doing. But it goes beyond just naming the gift of pastoral care. We need to name all of the gifts in our communities. We need to see where we can take the burdens away from people who aren't called to carry them. Ministers in the Religious Society of Friends wear a lot of hats. In addition to the ministry they feel particularly called to, ministers end up filling so many other roles, especially education and fundraising. How much more could ministers be doing if they could just focus on their call instead of educating and fundraising? So what do? We can lighten the load for each other by each doing what God is calling us to do. We can recognize gifts, name them, and encourage people to grow in their gifts and callings. We can give people training, support and accountability, and places to exercise their gifts. Let's set up systems to educate friends about naming and supporting ministry. Let's strengthen our corporate discernment and corporate support. We can't leave all of this to the individuals. This way of caring for each other will strengthen the life and the witness of the Religious Society of Friends. Thank you.
Good. Thank you, Ashley. And next up will be Wess Daniels.
Hi, friends. Thank you for inviting me to be on the panel, and thank you to all of you who are here today. It's nice to see all of your faces. I'm glad there's been space given for what I expect will be a rigorous and critical examination of Quaker theology, Quaker pastoral theology here. As someone who's practiced ministry among friends for over 20 years, I must admit that I've been underwhelmed by the lack of attention and development of a pastoral theology that is rooted in our tradition and relevant to the times we live in. For a practice that goes back to at least the 1860s, it is surprising that so little has been said about it after 160 years. This is not just a lost opportunity, but a grave deficit friends face. Many of the problems Gurneyite Quakerism faces in terms of tradition drift, division, and at least in the US, shrinking congregations, is because Friends have not apprenticed people into the practice of Quaker pastoring. I'm keenly aware of the recent publications by Derek Brown, sorry about that, and Phil Baisley, and am grateful that the drought may finally be coming to an end. I hope this panel will be an inspiration for further development on this topic. For my part, instead of rehashing history or giving an apology for the Quaker pastorate, I want to start with where we are and accept that this as a consequence of the faithfulness of earlier friends, setting out to offer a forward-looking vision for Quaker pastoral practice and theology in a time of empire. One that takes seriously our current context within global information culture and what the Poor People's Campaign calls the 5 interlocking evils of systemic racism, poverty, the war economy, climate devastation, and the distorted moral narrative of Christian nationalism. One that focuses specifically on what can make Quaker pastoring unique and needed in this time. In order to develop the what of this vision, I want to begin with how to get there. It is essential that a person called to serve their meeting as a released minister sees themselves first becoming an apprentice to the Quaker tradition. According to Alistair MacIntyre, apprentices are those who become aware of their tradition and of its direction, and in a self-aware fashion, attempt to engage in its debates and carry its inquiries further. Quaker pastors see the practice of pastoring as a craft within their tradition, something they are formed by, study, and within the tradition that they are a part of. A Quaker pastor as apprentice of the tradition is someone who shares in the, this is a quote from McIntyre, contingencies of its history, understanding its story as one's own, and finding a place for oneself as a character in the enacted narrative, which is that story so far. Renewal and remixing of the Quaker tradition, or any tradition for that matter, happens not at the whim of any person who shows up, but the practitioners and apprentices who are devoted to the ongoing revitalization of their tradition. Those who wish to be Quaker pastors must undergo this kind of apprenticeship, even if it is in the midst of the work they are currently doing. If they wish to link past and future and draw upon the tradition to interpret and reinterpret it. Furthermore, for Quaker pastors to see themselves as apprentices to the tradition means that they will not accept the maintenance of the status quo and will take seriously the challenges it faces and seek to help their tradition move forward in light of them. These are the ones in partnership with other Quaker apprentices in their tradition who center the practices in such a way that they have become subordinate not only to the community that now constitutes those practices, but to the historical community of practitioners, those who preceded the community and whose achievements have made possible the existence of the present community. In this way, they accept the authority of the tradition and have the best possibility of extending it into the future. This is critical to the development of pastoral theology and practice within the Quaker tradition. One must see themselves as a part of the present and historical community, accept its authority, and proceed accordingly. Therefore, they understand that there is no such thing as pastor as such, but only a pastor within the Quaker tradition, within this present context and community, carrying that tradition and its teachings forward. As Friends develop models for apprenticing leaders to the tradition, supporting them in becoming self-aware of the tradition they stand within, and practicing how they carry it forward in time, there needs to be a vision and shape to what is being passed down. That is what I want to turn my attention to now, suggesting 3 characteristics that point to the uniqueness and usefulness of a Quaker pastor in our context. The first one, the Quaker pastor practices making apprentices to the Quaker tradition. Having undergone or at least started their own process of apprenticeship, the Quaker pastor makes opportunities for more apprentices within their congregation and tradition. This not only develops strong leadership within the community, but allows for deeper participation in the spiritual life of the congregation, as well as making room for the needed remix and renewal necessary to adapt in these challenging times. By teaching Quaker theology and practice as a craft to be learned and extended, makes it more robust, vibrant, and our communities more resilient. This role of pastor as apprentice and teacher should not be a surprise. This is the original reason for the creation of the pastoral system. The rise of pastors within the Quaker tradition was, according to Barber and Frost, not due to a particular evangelical theology, but to late fruits of the revivals. The need arose out of a hunger that was felt by those who joined meetings after revivals with no previous Quaker background, for whom Quaker elders felt the need for a teaching program. The Gurneyite tradition innovated on its tradition by allowing a system to emerge within its communities that would care for the great influx of members starting in the 1860s. This initial role of the minister was to apprentice a new generation of Quakers into the tradition. And that need has not changed, even if, and especially because many program yearly meetings today tend to be more committed to evangelical theology and a more conservative understanding of the gospel than what is original to the Quaker tradition. The need remains and is great for the return of a radical liberation Christian Quakerism that recaptures that original vision of Friends. Friends in the generations leading up to the pastoral innovation largely came out of what I call birthright culture, a culture that is primarily family-based and concerned with preservation and legacy. What is passed down in birthright culture is done so only implicitly and through inheritance. This view is encapsulated by the saying, Quakerism can only be caught, not taught. However, the shift towards pastoral work opens up the possibility of a return to convincement culture, similar to what was witnessed in the first generation of Friends. Convincement culture leans towards an open-ended model of change, is open to the outsider, and passes on its teachings and practices explicitly through apprenticeship. Convincement culture is open to change and remix because it moves towards an internalization of the tradition rather than through genes and externalized forms. Quaker pastors, as people steeped in their tradition, holding it lightly enough to allow it to adapt and change according to the leadings of the Spirit and the needs and discernment of their communities, are able to guide renewal through the practice of making apprentices. Second, Quaker pastors work within the participatory core of the Quaker tradition. There is no reason why Friends should not think that God gave Quakers the pastoral stream to Gurneyite Quakers. Rather than seeing pastors as a betrayal of Quaker theology, it is a remix. It is a faithful betrayal. It is not meant to be a wholesale adoption of the Methodist or Nazarene theologies and practice that it has often become. It is meant to be an entire revisioning of the role of the pastor within the context of a highly participative Quaker tradition. For instance, a pastor working within the liturgy of silence as their main context is going to act and live and practice faith in a very different way from other liturgical contexts. Participation in the listening community grounds their work, and out of that context, a new take and a new look on pastoring arises. If the headship of Christ and the liturgy of silence are central frames of reference, that shifts everything. This is grounds for a far more participatory theology than one where a pastor or priest conducts a high liturgy before a congregation. A Quaker pastor committed to the original Quaker vision, working out of the context of a liturgy of silence, it would not seek to become God's intermediary, taking Jesus's role as the head of the church. In fact, the early Quaker conviction that Christ has come to teach the people himself is both an anti-Christendom, anti-religion of empire claim, as it is a defining characteristic of how the Quaker community organizes itself. A Quaker pastor's main goal is to support the creation of a participatory space that allows for Christ to lead the congregation or the people. The act itself will lead the congregation, as the Quaker tradition has demonstrated over the past 350 years, in resistance to Christendom and other forms of the religion of empire. Following this thread on participation, we might say that the Quaker pastor is a transitional object from Catholic theology, one who is meant to be a pass-through, a conduit to God. I prefer Peggy Morrison's metaphor. Quaker pastors are better thought of as sheepdogs than as shepherd. Jesus is the good shepherd. Quaker pastors watch the periphery and make sure the congregation is listening to the shepherd. Lastly, to be a Quaker pastor is to practice revolutionary faithfulness. This kind of participatory theology leads to and nurtures the congregation to see themselves as co-laborers with Christ in the unfolding liberation of the world, as R.W. Tucker called it in his article, Revolutionary Faithfulness. A revolutionary faithfulness to that original vision of liberation over against wealth, power, comfort, and the secularization of values. In the same way that the original Quaker pastors were quite literally a disruption to Quaker practice that had become focused on comfortability and fascination with silence and birthright culture, Quakers today are meant to be a disruptive force for friends who are tempted to become too comfortable, too insular, too precious in the face of the 5 interlocking evils I mentioned earlier. The original Quaker message is a message against the religion of empire, a prophetic message and practice that seeks to recover the Jesus of the disinherited and stand with those whose backs are against the wall, as Howard Thurman called it. The early Quaker movement was a poor people's campaign led by the empowered poor and dispossessed, organized around a liberatory message that Jesus, who came to release the captives and bring good news to the poor, was now present and leading friends. It is not a coincidence that Quakerism began in the poorer north of England and was led in large part by a man who was uneducated and from a lower working class family. So what does it mean then to take this into our context and think about Quaker pastors in our time of empire? In a time where nearly 41 million Americans are living below the poverty line and 140 million people are either poor or low income. And when the current annual military budget at $668 billion dwarfs the $190 billion allocated for education, jobs, housing, and other basic services and infrastructure. Out of every dollar in the federal discretionary spending, 53 cents goes towards the military, with just 15 cents spent on anti-poverty programs. That's from the study, The Souls of Poor Folks, from the Poor People's Campaign. Beyond this, there are hundreds of thousands of people dying from COVID and many more who have lost their jobs and homes because of the pandemic. Meanwhile, we live in a state of perpetual war, ongoing police brutality, and ecological devastation. I see an essential part of the role of the Quaker pastor is to reinvigorate the revolutionary message of Jesus and the disinherited, the early message of the friends, and those who stand with the poor and dispossessed, resisting empire. The Quaker pastor can be a harbinger of revolutionary faithfulness within their yearly meetings. Rather than becoming part of the comfortable birthright culture, they are to help disrupt that which lulls Quaker communities to sleep and leads them into ignorance and detachment around the suffering of our neighbors. Instead, they are to relink their communities to this revolutionary message, relinking them to an empathetic and participatory reading of Jesus, the poor, brown-skinned Palestinian Jew living under Roman occupation in the 1st century, helping Quaker communities see themselves within the ongoing story of God's liberation of and through the poor and dispossessed. This is what we need in our time of empire. So in conclusion, if friends are to get there, there needs to be a deeper understanding and mastery of the tradition, an acceptance that the pastoral tradition within Quakerism is a legitimate and spirit-led remix that needs to continue to be developed, a bringing along of people as apprentices into that tradition, and an understanding and faithfulness to the revolutionary message that has been passed down from Jesus to our Quaker ancestors and now to us. Thank you, friends.
Thank you so much, Wes. And next we will have Oscar. Can you spotlight Oscar, Christy?
I can when he actually starts his video.
Oh, okay. There he is.
Are you okay now? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Sorry about that. I was saying I'm most thankful and humbled to be part of this discussion. And I will generally look at the Quaker pastoral theology and its embodiment in the community. And in my reflection, it's majorly divided into two parts. I will explore the meaning of Quaker pastoral theology and then look at the embodiment of Quaker pastoral ministry. Meaning of Quaker pastoral theology. In thinking about Quaker pastoral theology, especially in the contemporary world, it is vital to refer to the historical roots. Alfred R. John, in defining pastoral theology, argues that an essential part of this study, as we shall see throughout, is the examination of ways in which contemporary, I added Quaker pastoral attitudes and actions draw on older Christian Quaker thought and practice. This is now necessary because secular pastoral insight has become so generally advanced in the 20th century that some think it supplants all that has gone before. Pink Dandelion gives a general picture of the pastoral Quakerism today by noting pastoral Quakerism extended beyond holiness Quakerism and today covers a wide theological spectrum, including modernist, holiness, and fundamentalist perspectives. In this analysis, it means the Quaker luster or identity is eroding or has eroded, which is a matter of concern. It is in this connection that Lawton Hessel offers a wise counsel in suggesting that friends are torn between loyalty to historic Quakerism and recognition of contemporary needs. What we need to do is to examine the concept of the Quaker ministry as conceived by early friends, to discover its weaknesses and strengths, and then to define unapologetically the function of the Quaker pastorate today. Serving as a pastor and doing pastoral ministry should be vital in continuing the original call of Quakerism, as noted in the introductory part of the Christian faith and practice of Quakers in East Africa, that the Religious Society of Friends Church Quakers began out of a reform movement within the larger Christian church and does not seek to depart from any of the valid principles and biblical foundations of the Christian church. Early friends wished to reject the formal church practices, which had grown up in the church since New Testament times, and sought to return to the power and simplicity of the New Testament church. Dandelion explains further by noting, thus, these Quakers critiqued the outward as if impacted on worldly speech, but also on empty theology, which was not rooted in the experience of the direct encounter with God. Understanding this call is inherent in the formation of Quaker theology, which is foundational in informing the meaning of Quaker pastoral theology and how it should be embodied in the community. Slipping into the trap of an empty theology can easily happen when there are squabbles here and there. Quaker pastoral theology rooted in experiential theology should help develop how a Quaker pastor and pastoral ministry should look like or is supposed to be. In applying the valid principles of biblical foundation of the Christian church, a pastor should be the conduit of revealing God's revelation in Jesus Christ to humanity. It is elaborated in the image of the Good Shepherd, encapsulated in what would be Jesus's pastoral role. Harold Taylor notes, this idea of caring shepherd was so familiar and meaningful to the people of Israel that many preachers and writers used it. As we see in the New Testament as well as in the Old Testament, as a picture language to describe not only human shepherds, but also the attitudes of God towards his people. Some critical texts in the New Testament for reference are John 10, 1-16, Hebrews 13:20, Matthew 16:18, John 21:15-16, Acts 20:28, and 1 Peter 5:2-3. Embracing the image of shepherding fulfills the experience of the direct encounter with God, which should be profound in Quaker pastoral ministry and is foundational in the theology of ministry. Pet Ward is right in articulating God's being is a dynamic or moved being that is revealed in ministry towards humanity. Theology comes from encountering the ministry of God. Being careful in not becoming a hindrance to the mystery of God, God's revelation to humanity and all creation, is the most significant task of a Quaker pastor and pastoral ministry. It is with no doubt that God is encountered in the great work the Quaker pastors do. What comes out of pastoral ministry is always for the good of humanity and God creation. Phil Campbell articulates, the goal of helping persons become fully functioning individuals is an essential component of effective and compassionate pastoral care. It is important to note that being careful in not becoming a hindrance to the transformational work pastoral ministry does is primary. The second part is embodiment of Quaker pastoral ministry. The role of pastor and pastoral ministry has elicited different views among Quakers. Existence of lingering questions continues up to date. Meaning of Quaker pastor and pastoral ministry has been evolving with time. Derek Brown articulates, for there are some Quakers who believe that the pastoral role is anathema to the very heart of the Quakerism, while others believe that the Quaker distinctives in faith and practice should be secondary, if not marginal concern to a friend's pastor. Even within programmed and pastoral Quakerism, there is lack of unified understanding of the pastoral role, specifically an explicit expectation and understanding of the boundaries of leadership and authority. The historical background of the Quaker church leadership provided in chapter I wrote on the concept of hierarchy and doing ministry, evaluating the roles of leaders and the use of authority in Quakerism, offers an overview of how pastoral ministry came to be and how it has impacted the formation of Quakerism. There was a shift from participatory to hierarchical nature of ministry, which remains a matter of concern among Quakers. The understanding of Quaker pastoral ministry draws from the work a pastor does, that is enlisted as planning, leading and coordinating public worship of the church, involving other members as participants in worship leadership, providing pastoral care and counseling, conducting marriages and funerals, visiting those who are sick, and home visitation, providing instruction in Christian faith and discipleship, general pastoral administration, reaching out to those who are outside the meeting and involving others in outreach, providing care of widows and orphans. This is guided by the Quaker way of doing ministry, which is participatory, as described in the understanding of ministers and pastors. It is noted all disciples of the Lord Jesus Christ are to be ministers and should use their spiritual gifts in a service to each other to proclaim the gospel faithfully in the daily life. The bone of contention lies in deviation of understanding of the Quaker way of ministry. Robert Barclay provided the insightful meaning of ministry by stating that every true minister of gospel is ordained, prepared, and equipped for work of the ministry. Every evangelist and every Christian pastor ought to be led and directed by his labor and work of the gospel by the leadings, motions, and drawings of God's light. This should govern not only the place where, but the persons to whom he speaks and the time when he should speak. Those who have this authority ought to preach the gospel even when they are without human commission or are illiterate. If they lack the authority of the divine gift, no matter how learned they may be, or what authorization they may have from men, or how well they may be commissioned by churches, they should be considered deceivers and not true ministers of the gospel. Those who have received this holy and spotted gift have received it without cost and should give it without charge. They should not certainly use it as a trade to earn money. In discussions I have had with most pastors, and having served as a pastor, the historical background of Quaker ministry worship influences the Quaker view of pastoral ministry. There is need to analyze and evaluate how the church embraces and views the pastors. It is for certain that caution has to be taken, as pastoral ministry seems to be a burden to the church. A case study in this part of the world can be seen in the support available for training pastors and sustaining pastoral ministry. I remember going to church when I was serving as a pastor and overheard some members saying they were wondering why pastors should be trained and even be paid, and yet the gospel was freely given. In my early years in serving in ministry, I would go without being given any pay for 3 months, and even what would be given would be so minimal. It continues to be an experience for many pastors even up to date. Serving as a pastor can be fulfilling and can be the best decision that one can make in life. At times it is easy to decide wrongly, not being so clear whether or not one is being called to serve in pastoral ministry. Having a call from God to serve as a pastor is vital. It hinges on the divine agency that is foundational in pastoral ministry. With me, I was assured of the calling to serve through God's still voice. Human agency is vital too. In some other parts of the world, the clearness committee serves this purpose. At times, it is difficult to know when one is being called to serve. It is very critical and can be problematic when there is no clear calling to serve as a pastor and still go ahead. One does not just wake up one morning and say, I want to become a pastor. To serve as a pastor needs preparation, and it takes God's grace to serve in ministry. Care has to be taken in being aware of those who are ministered to, in understanding how they conceptualize pastoral ministry. At times, there can be tendencies of the pastor being questionable on account of being contrary to the shepherding role. Different contexts inform how pastoral ministry happens. In the case of the African context, a critical area to examine is the interaction of culture and faith and how it impacts the embodiment of pastoral ministry. The practice of Christian faith is a continuity of both African and Christian religions. Cultural practices are found by both the African biblical cultures, and the influence of technology could be either constructive or destructive if care is not taken. General guidance for Quaker pastors lies in the words of George Fox, in being patterns and examples in the world, in reaching out not only those within the precincts of the church, but even those beyond the walls of the church, in making true Christianity realized to the whole world as the original intent of Quakerism. And these are the words of George Fox, and this is the word of the Lord God to you all, a charge to you all, and a charge to you all in the presence of living God. Be patterns, be examples in all counties, places, islands, nations, wherever you come, that your courage and life may preach among all sorts of people and to them. Then you will come to appear cheerfully over the world, answering that of God in everyone, whereby in them ye may be blessing and make the witness of God in them to bless you. Then to the Lord God you shall be a sweet savour and a blessing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Oscar, bringing us the word from Kenya. Really appreciate it. Okay, next we have Derek Brown.
Thank you all for having me. In 1912, the practical theologian Theodore Soares wrote this regarding Christian clergy in America. Quote, "It is a simple and lamentable fact that the Christian ministry today has altogether too large a portion of religious ignoramuses, spiritually minded incompetents, consecrated dullards," end quote. Besides being the greatest theological quote ever and being quite harsh, it is a helpful and humorous example of the tension that can arise, especially in the evangelical world, between academia and the ministry. And evangelical friends are not immune. For I heard that a friend's pastor commenting on this gathering stated something to the effect of, why would I listen to people who aren't doing pastoral ministry talk about pastoral ministry? I interact with those who are actually doing ministry. Thus, while Soares' statement may have arisen from some ivory tower elitism, it could also have been elicited out of frustration at resistance given by pastors to support or input from academia. Perhaps pastors do not perceive the practical benefit from theological research. Is there a way forward that would increase the cooperation between scholars and Christian Quaker pastors and their congregations in the creation of theory and the modification of praxis? I propose that a dual practical theological research paradigm using both inductive empirical and deductive theological modalities can be utilized to facilitate confessional, pastoral, theological, and ecclesiological research with the increased partnership and cooperation of congregations in programmed Friends meetings. And there's a need for such effort. Jennifer Buck, in her 2017 article in Quaker Religious Thought, provided case studies of unbalanced hybridity between evangelical Friends theology and ecclesiology and other theo-denominational paradigms. I'm grateful to her for her image of colonization to describe one doctrinal or cultural position subsuming the other, as it is a great improvement over the metaphors I've tried to use to describe the outcome of uneven and contentious dialectics that is often observed between evangelical and Friends identities within local and yearly meetings, and especially between program Friends and non-Quaker theological influences that colonize the ideological and identity space left by the lack of familiarity of, adherence to, or active distrust of Quaker distinctives by programmed Friends meetings. I've previously argued that this ethodic disconnect has its origins in the adoption of the pastoral system, in which the pastoral role was not adequately integrated into Quaker ecclesiology. Coupled with the subsequent influx of extra-denominational clergy, this meant that the Quaker ethos did not properly shape the pastoral role, and reciprocally that the Quaker distinctives were not promoted or maintained by Quaker pastors. While further research is necessary, I propose that this was coupled with a lack of congregational understanding of the role of the pastor within the broader Quaker understanding of the priesthood of all believers, leading not only to an increased passivity by members, but also an ecclesiologically unsteady conceptualization of pastoral ministry. And added to this conceptual fuzziness were the intra-denominational tensions between proto-evangelical and evangelical Friends yearly meetings on one side and Quakers on the other end of the theological spectrum. And while not making any value judgments here, my field notes have recorded instances that reveal these phenomena, evangelicalism and Quakerism, with all its sort of semiotic baggage, are highly charged, especially among certain age demographics, with some on the evangelical side questioning the very use of the word Quaker. The collective result of this, along with, of course, a myriad of other interrelated factors, is a perception that Christian pastoral Quakerism has lacked a theological and ecclesiological framework with which to understand pastoral ministry within the broader ethos and distinctives of Quakerism. Even Friends scholars situated firmly within the evangelical sphere appear to struggle articulating a paradigm that is distinctly Quaker. In Arthur Roberts' chapter on evangelical Quakers in the Oxford Handbook, he often describes their theology and ecclesiology in contradistinction or concordance with other theological denominational models, such as Neo-Wesleyan sanctification or Presbyterian type polity. I propose that practical theology, as both a theological discipline and as an interdisciplinary research methodology, could be utilized to conceptualize and articulate a Quaker pastoral practical theology that both maintains the current reality of Friends pastoral ministry, while also providing a normative ideal that promotes the valuable distinctives of Quakerism within their Christian framework. The reason I use practical theology instead of pastoral theology is not only to segue into a methodological discussion, but also to highlight that the proper realization of a polycharismatic, polyparticipatory, and polycentric Quaker ecclesiology within programmed meetings requires the understanding, acceptance, and engagement of all the members to not just participate and contribute their spiritual giftings, but also to properly partner in ministry with the pastor, providing accountability of and support to the pastor in a way that promotes egalitarianism and prevents authoritarianism. Now, while practical theology has been criticized for being conceptually vague, with a myriad of definitions, it is helpful, even if it's somewhat reductionist, to view the discipline as split between two schools of thought, a Schleiermachian deductive model and a Brownian, not me, interdisciplinary inductive model. Schleiermacher is credited with popularizing the concept of practical theology as a separate discipline, and he labored under the assumption that all theology was essentially practical. Thus, theology provided the prescriptive and normative behaviors of ministry to be applied in the field. It was the, quote, crown of the theological tree. He did not mind mixing metaphors, flowing from the roots of philosophical theology and the trunk of historical theology. The critique of this paradigm is that this theory to practice paradigm, later developed by Nietzsche, was criticized as originating in the abstract, and thus suffering from what Christian Greithlein called a, quote, removal from the reality of practice. The alternative, proposed much later, gained primacy through the work of Don Browning and subsequently others. The Browning or inductive model sought to replace the theory to practice with practice to theory to practice model, utilizing interdisciplinary methods, but primarily the social sciences, to observe phenomena and case studies occurring within contemporary ministries or faith communities. And this was often manifested in a cyclical model of describing the phenomena, often referred to as a crisis, interpreting it in light of normative theological or faith community praxis, critically reflecting upon the disparities between normative beliefs and observed phenomena, and then closing the loop by proposing either the creation or modification of theory, or the addition, subtraction, or modification of praxis within the case. The benefits proposed by the inductive model include an increased scholarly rigor through methodological validity and analysis, while at the same time closing the loop by offering theory creation or praxis modification within the case. Utilizing Kirshner's categories of Quaker theology and philosophy, this modality would fall within the, quote, internal constructive category, for it is offering at its conclusion a new and innovative expression of Quaker worship, ministry, and faith community. Now, the Brownian or inductive imperial model is and has been the dominant modality of practical theological research, with Hermans and Schumann noting that there is a deep consensus that practical theology should both begin and end at the level of practical concern. However, the deductive, theologically driven practical theology, meant to convey normative standards based in hermeneutics and theology, has a small contingent of adherents who believe that the inductive model is too reliant on social science methods and has become less transcendent in its outlook, and thus have begun crafting constructive practical theologies around the Schleiermacher-Bardian paradigm. Andrew Root, Graham Buxton are just a couple of examples. What I propose is that perhaps both models of practical theology, the deductive theological and the inductive empirical, are not mutually exclusive and may have use not only in the scholarly contributions to the research, understanding, and construction of a Quaker programmed practical theology, but also in increasing the chances of a confessional cooperational intersection between the ministerial and academic vocations. The inductive empirical model, of course, allows not only for thick, rich descriptions of phenomena and religious lived experience, but also provides that internal constructivist orientation that ultimately serves the church and the people the church serves. It also creates the avenue to engage local ministers in studying and participating in empirical research. As a pastor in our MA program said to me after their first research methods course, quote, pastors ought to be exposed to this more, end quote. I agree. The deductive theological modality, on the other hand, may be perceived as inferior to the empirical model, a relic of a time before interdisciplinary methodological innovations. However, I would argue that further research is necessary for perhaps the deductive model can also be of use in the ecclesial conceptualization and articulation of pastoral theology. For one goal of this model is to provide a normative theological paradigm from which ministry actions are derived. And I would argue that no such normative, constructive, practical theology yet exists in programmed Friends ecclesiology. The benefits of such a constructive, practical theology, if accepted, maybe at least tacitly so, as normative by Christian programmed Quakers, are multifold. An immediate benefit that it would improve the empirical research, as one step in the method is to critically reflect upon the observed and described phenomenon, utilizing normative, theological, and ecclesiological beliefs of the movement within the case study. Second, perhaps theology is the way to mitigate the discordancy between evangelical or Christian and Quaker identity narratives that often compete within local and yearly meetings. By connecting evangelical friends to the Quaker distinctives through their scriptural foundations, creating a stronger doctrinal hybridization. Regarding the pastoral, or specifically, a constructive practical theology can help guide the transcendent ethos of the pastoral role in Quakerism by guiding the training and education, congregational expectations, and the implicit and explicit behaviors of pastoral ministry within the Quaker context. An example of a deductive practical theology can be found in Hans Kung's The Church. Kung, a Swiss Roman Catholic theologian and Bardian scholar, wrote a practical theology with a hermeneutical and theological starting point, moving forward towards a normative expectation of ecclesial structure and behavior. With scripture as a starting point, Kung articulated the following key points of a Catholic practical theology and ecclesiology. One, that a monarchical episcopate is unbiblical. Two, that there should be no mediation or an unmediated access to God. Three, that the priesthood of all believers, a non-gender restricted priesthood, is central to the structure and function of the church. Four, the church must be pneumatologically sensitive and polycharismatic. And five, any ecclesiology must, by its very nature, be non-hierarchical and egalitarian. Sounds very Quakerish, doesn't it? Yet, in spite of his inherent critique, Kung does not lead the reader away from Catholicism, nor does he call for the abolishment of the ecclesiastical offices, only for their reframing and reform. While the direct efficacy of this ecclesiology on the Roman Catholic Church may appear limited, the point is that the articulation of biblical practical theology promoting an egalitarian, gender-neutral, non-sacerdotal, charismatic Roman Catholic ecclesiology could not have occurred, in my opinion, with just the empirical method and a starting point in the lived experience of contemporary Catholic tradition, dogma, and praxis. It had to begin in the abstract, in the theological ideal, and push forward from there. In the same way, when conceptualizing a future Quaker practical theology, perhaps the way forward is not just a richer analysis of the current lived religion of programmed and unprogrammed Quakers, or a critique of the ecclesiological decisions of past Quakers, but also the efforts of Quakers, scholars, pastors, everyone, to articulate the theological and ecclesiological ideals of the current ecclesial forms and structures to best promote and maintain those ideals. However, further exploration on this topic is necessary. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Derek. And then we have Phil Baisley to wrap this up. Phil?
Well, before I speak, I would like to, Christy, if you would let me do some screen sharing, I would just like to turn your attention to a very familiar image. Can you see it?
We got it.
Okay, just look at it for a minute. Well, thank you for inviting me to this illustrious panel. I'm going to read what I planned on saying because I didn't know where my turn was going to be. So here's what I wrote. And I actually don't have it printed because just as I was going downstairs to print this talk today, we had a power outage. And I've been waiting to hear that the printer is back online, but it is not. So I guess I'll use my phone. Anyway, this is how I started. Thank you for inviting me to this illustrious panel. I suspect anything I say will be redundant unless I speak first. If I'm speaking, then I must be first. Woohoo! Okay, so I wasn't first. And maybe I'm not going to be completely redundant. So here goes. What is a Quaker pastoral theology? And how is it enfleshed, embodied in community? By definition, pastoral theology sets theology in context. It's theology with hands and feet attached. So I'd like to talk first about Friends theology and then about our hands and feet. One fine May morning about 18 years ago, I was teaching a class called The Friends Pastor to a half dozen Earlham School of Religion students. I wanted to establish some common ground among these students who hailed from 4 different yearly meetings, all within the boundaries of what is known as programmed or pastoral Quakerism. So I began by asking them to identify what beliefs are held in common by the highest percentage of friends throughout the world. Unbeknownst to me, in the classroom next door, Steve Angel was teaching a class called Ministry Among Unprogrammed Friends. Steve also was attempting to establish common ground by asking his students what central beliefs unite friends of all traditions. While adherence to friends' testimonies received some mention by both groups, the interpretation of those testimonies was so varied as to be as much a disuniting force as one that unifies friends. The only belief identified by both classes that may be shared by most friends, whether programmed or unprogrammed, whether in the Americas, Africa, Asia, or Europe, is in the immediate presence of God in worship. It is this belief that informs every part of Friends' beliefs and practice. I believe it is the foundation of Friends' pastoral theology. I see Friends' theology depicted in a very specific image. I'm getting a phone call. I can't help that one. That's not my phone. Not my real phone, just my office phone. Anyway, disregard that. I see Friends' theology depicted in a very specific image, that of Doyle Penrose's painting of the presence in the midst. It's one image that seems to unite most of Quakerism. That's why you'll find a print of it hanging in meeting houses in settings as diverse as England, Kenya, and Ohio. Some friends might call the spectral image Jesus, another spirit, another the divine presence. But what the vast majority of friends agree on is that God, quote unquote, is present and active in our meetings. The adjective I've often used to describe Quaker pastoral theology is presence-driven. Every aspect of ministry that happens in a friends meeting reflects this. And this is where the theology is embodied. Consider worship. Presence-driven worship is found not only among unprogrammed friends, it is also foundational to worship among those friends who have adopted the pastoral system. Most programmed Quaker meetings include some element of waiting worship or open worship, or as we say at Greenfield Friends, communion in the manner of friends. And it's the same process as is followed, at least a similar process as is followed in unprogrammed meetings. The difference is often only in duration. What happens in presence-driven worship is that friends gather in silence and for the Spirit. They expect the Spirit to be present and to participate in meeting. If the Spirit gives a message valuable for the entire group or a significant part of it, the person to whom that message is given speaks. If for some reason the present spirit does not speak, then neither do the people. Well, what about speaking in meeting? Historically, among friends, certain folks have been recognized for their gifts in vocal ministry. In many meetings, there were those weighty friends from whom it was not uncommon that messages regularly came. I think pastors fall into that category among program friends today. However, pastors follow, or at least should follow, the same constrictions as every other person in meeting. Don't speak unless God gives you something to say. And what God gives you to say may come on Sunday morning in worship. It may come during the week at the coffee shop where you're writing your sermon, or it may not come at all. In my book, The Same But Different, Ministry in the Quaker Pastor, I have a chapter about preaching. In it, I recount stories of times when the Spirit has changed the message or the messenger, even in the middle of a meeting for worship. That happens because it is the divine presence who drives the meeting, not the pastor or the clerk. Presence-driven work is another aspect of Quaker pastoral theology. Quakers do church administration differently than the Presbyterian church down the street. Why? Because we expect the divine presence to guide our decision-making. We don't say bookend prayers at the beginning and ending of our business meetings. The entire meeting is an act of worship and prayer because the presence is there. Not just there, but leading. Quakers do evangelism and outreach differently than our Baptist brothers and sisters. Why? Because we don't believe that the Spirit is something that must be injected into empty souls. Rather, we see this world not with devils filled, oh gee, that's a Lutheran image, sorry, but awash with the Spirit of Christ, with whom we mutually respond as we walk cheerfully on the earth. I could go on. Ashley gave a wonderful description of presence-driven pastoral care in community. But I think you know where I'm heading. That presence is in the midst of everything we do in pastoral theology because that presence is in the midst of who we are as Quakers. And that's where the embodiment in community comes in. Quakerism doesn't work individually. It works in community. I had this vividly explained to me by a Sufi friend in Turkey a few years ago. This gentleman, Nadir, contacted the Quaker Information Network because he wanted to explore Christian mysticism and had been reading about Friends. Tim Side, who at that time presided over the network, gave me his contact information since I'd been to Turkey a couple of times. Turns out I was planning to be in Istanbul later that year. So I told Nadir I could swing down to Izmir and meet with him in person. I stayed with Nadir and his wife, and we talked about Quakers. At the end of my first evening there, Nadir walked me to my room and declared, "Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock, we will have Quaker worship." And we did. We gathered in silence, and about 20 minutes in, Nadir gave a message. It was wonderful. When I left a couple of days later, Nadir and I agreed to meet online once a month for Quaker worship. After a couple of strained, long-distance worship attempts, this was before Zoom, we stopped. Nadir summed it up. He said, "If I want to sit alone and meditate, I don't need to be on my computer with you." I agreed. What we were doing was not Quaker worship. It was individual meditation with laptops on. Quakerism is always embodied, enfleshed, and meshed in community. The presence is in the midst of something. The light may be in you and me individually, but the presence is found where two or more are gathered. COVID-19 has pushed our communal boundaries for sure, but you and I know that some of those Zoom meetings for worship were real worship because we were gathered. From those gathered meetings, local or virtual, presence-driven stuff happens. We worshiped, we prayed and preached, we answered that of God and others, we took care of meeting business, we gave pastoral care, we organized social action events. We were able to do it because we truly believed the divine presence was with us, in us, and activating us together. I believe this sense of divine presence, coupled with the necessity and testimony of community, along with our non-creedal stance and commitment to social justice, in other words, the heart and hands and feet of Quakerism, make our society poised to be a real influence in contemporary America and the world. And that's where I was going to end, but I got one more thing. This whole idea of taking seriously the divine presence being in meeting with us and driving everything we do in pastoral theology, that's not quite the way most of the church sees it. And that can be a little problem. Taking seriously the idea of God being actively present in our lives and meetings sometimes puts us at odds with other faith traditions, especially American Christianity. I experienced this not too long ago when I began a new pastorate. My preferred office is a table at the local coffee shop, so I was delighted to find a warm, inviting establishment near the meeting house. I began spending my Tuesdays there working on my sermons. Right next door, there's a consignment shop featuring creations by area artisans, and they have a book department for local authors. Well, I met the owners the first Tuesday I was in town. They were delighted to hear that I was an author, especially one who writes for the Christian market. They said they'd love to carry my book, and they even wanted me to come to do like a book signing there. They asked for 5 copies, which they'd sell on consignment, and I agreed to bring them next week and have a meet and greet with local folks. I brought the books the following Tuesday. By then, the owners had changed their minds. They said I could put some promotional material on display, but not the books themselves. Seems that after reading the book, they felt it was too out there for their customers. They liked some of what I described as the Quaker way of doing pastoral ministry, and they thought the stories were interesting, but they didn't think their people would relate to some of the Quaker ideals, like what happens when God really shows up in worship, what happens when God really shows up through preaching or pastoral care or activism or whatever. Fact is, when pastors follow those Quaker ideals, they really are out there. And while new generations are longing for an unmediated connection with the divine, a faith based not on blessed assurance, but on holy questioning, a lot of Christians cling to the status quo. That raised the ire of early friends, and they were persecuted for it. Stepping into the pulpit with the attitude that your sermon may be wrong for the audience, or the moment is difficult to, stepping into the pulpit with the attitude that your sermon may be wrong for the audience, and has to be taken away and stopped, may be difficult for people to grasp if they're used to messages wrapped in pastoral authority. So what may be a strength for us as Quakers, this presence-driven stuff, may appear as weakness, or at least out there-ness to the Christian world at large. But we continue to embody in community what is the core of Quaker pastoral theology. We worship, we work, we preach and teach and serve, knowing the divine presence drives us together as friends. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Phil. Appreciated your stories. You're such a great storyteller. Okay, folks. Well, everyone finished up in their 20 minutes of time or less. So we've got plenty of time now for questions and discussion. And we have a few questions that have come up already. And let me find those questions. And you can be asking more on the chat. The first question that came up comes from Julie Payton and Phil. They had a little discussion about it. Could the panel address the terms pastoral role or pastoral ministry and the paid professional job with special attention to overlaps and differences between them? So this is a question for anyone on the panel who wants to address that. Difference between pastoral role, pastoral ministry, and paid professional job. Who wants to jump in? Just unmute yourself when you're ready. You can take a minute to think about it.
I can start.
Great, thanks, Ashley.
Sure. So when I saw this question, I actually thought about Wess and how when he was pastor at Camas Friends, he referred to himself as the released minister in this community. And I think that's really useful language for Quakers. And we use pastor because that's what everyone knows. But in so many of our program meetings, the pastor is really the released minister in the community. So the person who is paid, hopefully, and dedicates most of their time to the work in the community. But as I spoke about in my talk, I think that there's a difference between a pastor and the gift of pastoral care. And we need to be careful not to expect all of the pastoral care to come from the pastor or the released minister.
I guess I'll add to that then, since Ashley voluntold me. I think that I found it really helpful to learn about that language from Brent Bill, and to think about the fact that, you know, in a meeting where there is someone being paid to do certain pastoral functions, they're being asked to do that by that meeting because the meeting has decided that they would like to spend their time and energy doing other things. And so they have designated this individual to take care of these specific tasks. That language, in the way it's been used in Quakerism, is meant to say we are all ministers and we all have the opportunity to participate in the community in that way. This individual has been given certain responsibilities so that the rest of us can go about doing our work as a congregation. And that helped. And I often had to sort of explain it to, especially to non-Quakers, or they thought that it meant that I had been fired. So, you know, but it was good to have those conversations and, you know, get into a little bit of Quaker theology that way.
Thanks, Wes. Someone else want to jump in?
I mean, I think the theological implications of a professionalized clergy, I think, are worth discussing. I do think that the paid aspect sometimes is the most brought up question, but perhaps the least important one, given that, I mean, Fox, Penn, Barclay, down the line, mentioned in some form of financially supporting those released to ministry. And so it is semantics, but there is precedent there. I don't think that's what they're talking about, especially since the joke is that the early pastoral system, they really took the non-paying pastors to heart. They rarely paid the pastors anything early on. And so financially, I think it's more the professionalization, and that's what the issue is what happens when someone is that for lack of that hireling. And so it is that question. I think Wess, I won't be redundant and echo Wess, except that it is the leveraging of giftings. If someone has a beautiful singing voice, is it wrong for the meeting to offer them a microphone to amplify that gifting for the blessing of others? No. It would be wrong if she was the only person or he was the only person allowed to sing. And if that person, if she or he started screaming when anyone else tried to sing. But in fact, the meeting could turn the microphone off, can take it away. There is an order and structure, and it's the same with ministry. You can leverage people's gifts, including the pastoral gifts, for the blessing of others, but it should always be done in accountability and proportion. Authoritarianism in pastoral ministry is just that gifting way out of proportion to the accountability and the gifts of others being utilized.
Thanks, Derek. Anyone else want to weigh in on this question? Has it been answered
About the
sufficiently?
professionalism,
Oscar?
the internet was having a problem. Are we still on the professional or
We're having some trouble with your audio, Oscar.
yes, I'm referring to the question about professionalism and the role of the pastor and pastoral ministry.
You're not coming in very clearly, I'm sorry. I don't know, is there a fix for that, Christy? No. Well, maybe you could type your response in the chat, Oscar. So I think Oscar will try to type his answer in the chat. I think, Phil, did you have your hand up?
Yeah.
Okay.
While Oscar's typing, I'll say my thing. I think pastoral ministry is kind of like it's the act of sheepdogging. I mean, that's what pastoral ministry is all about. When it gets to the thing is, the paid pastoral ministry comes when a meeting sets the parameters of what pastoral ministry of what pastoral ministry is within that meeting, and you know, that's fine because they're paying for the privilege of having the pastor do certain things and taking certain things on as their own responsibilities. But that also does constrict what the sheepdog does. And that's where sheepdogs can fall into this. Somebody just wrote something about a system. We can fall into this system where we're not sheepdogging anymore. We're not ministering as God called us. We are functioning in a role that we're paid to do. And that's a tough part of being a Quaker pastor. You know, it's doing pastoral ministry that you're called to do within a context that is trying to limit that to certain, you know, things in a job description. I don't have an answer for it. The answer, I think, comes up in whoever was talking about, I think what Wess talked about. is the concept of apprenticeship and apprenticing. And I think if we do more in making apprentices, I think perhaps then that will help us to break some of this system effect. So I really appreciate what Wes had to say about this, and I hope I've been making it part of my teaching, but now that I'm back in the pulpit again, I hope to make it more of a part of my paid ministry.
Okay, thanks, Phil. So let's move on to kind of a related question. In the models explored this morning, what might it mean to be good sheep? Or in other words, what pastoral theology do we need to develop for those who aren't pastors? Does it make sense to say a friend is good at being pastored, and why? Comes from Maddie Pennington in England. In the models explored this morning, what might it mean to be good sheep? In other words, what pastoral theology do we need to develop for those who aren't pastors? Does it make sense to say a friend is good at being pastored, and why?
I'll jump in. I think that yes, absolutely, and I think that this is part of the issue that we see. If you have a meeting where there's at least a critical mass of people who really do take their role seriously in terms of being apprentices to the Quaker tradition, then that creates the kind of community, or the potential for a community, that understands what it is to have a pastor in that role. Now, there's lots of churches and meetings that are just sort of operating out of a basic kind of non-denominational structure, and then you pull somebody into that system, and that person will not be necessarily progressing the Quaker tradition in any way. They may in fact sort of be the kind of person who is like the fox in the hen house, and actually steers that congregation completely away from the tradition. So I do think that a congregation that takes its role within the tradition very seriously is important, and it's going to relate differently to an individual who is a released minister or paid staff in one way or another, than a group that doesn't see itself in that tradition. So this is of course part of what I was trying to address in saying that it's whether we're talking about a released minister or in an unprogrammed meeting, having elders or other folks who are helping to actually empower and train people, and not just kind of assume that maybe over the next 10 years somebody will figure out what it means to be Quaker and that'll be great. No, we actually have to intentionally onboard people into our tradition. And if we're not doing that, then we open ourselves up, whether programmed or unprogrammed, for the fox in the hen house, so to speak.
I can go next.
Okay.
So I think there are good ways to receive pastoral care, and it's a little like receiving a compliment. You can be good or bad at it. So there's a lot of pressure to put up a good front and to act like everything is going well, and only share your accomplishments, especially on social media. And for people who are in need of pastoral care and receiving it, you have to be willing to be vulnerable and open to that, and to share the things that are hard in your life with a person in your community that you trust. And so I think it's on the individual to be open to that, but also on the community to make a space where it's safe to share the things in your life that aren't going as well, that aren't perfect for Instagram, and to provide care for each other.
Thanks, Ashley. Does anyone else want to weigh in on this question? Okay, let's move to a different question. This comes from Cherie Spock. What do panelists have to say about issues of equity in terms of resources, money, time, childcare, etc., in encouraging paid and unpaid pastoral ministries, especially when volunteering as a pastor requires a great deal of access to these resources of time, money, help, etc.? Very practical question. You have some thoughts on this? What do panelists have to say about issues of equity in terms of resources?
This is a tough one, and I'm not referencing anything I've heard here, but at the local meeting level, there can be selective outrage at the concept of paid ministry around the time of budgets and the time of raises and the time of hiring a pastor. One of the issues of that sort of shaky pastoral adoption is this issue of financially supporting a pastor was never really done well. And because there is this philosophical disagreement about whether or not a paid ministry is an objective good, that is the one thing that has slipped through the cracks. To say that pastors are poorly paid within the broader American ministry is saying something. And I think it is sort of hidden behind this sort of ongoing debate. I don't have the answer for that, except that I would rather have a non-pastoral meeting than a poorly or insufficiently paid pastoral meeting if it meant inequitous or sort of predatory relationship between the meeting and a pastor. That's not modeling justice. Now, if the pastor is fully willing to engage sacrificially because of areas of their life, financial decisions, etc., to work for free, for little or no money, that's a different conversation. But as someone who oversees young pastors to be, that is something that sort of concerns me. And I think congregations do work in good faith as much as possible. But in Friends Church, that fuzziness comes to play, especially.
Bill?
Yeah. In many congregations, there are two budget items that are almost equal in the amount expected to be given to them. One is building maintenance and the other is the pastor. And very often building maintenance wins out because people say, well, we got to keep the building up. And I think this has been a real problem for Friends. I think it's a problem for the church in general right now. And another one of the things I don't have the solution for. I've been a practicing and teaching bivocational minister for a long time, so I really believe in that. I'm also starting to believe now that maybe the time has come to be bivocational in the use of our buildings as well. I'm not a real big fan of steeple houses, simply because we keep saying that the church is people and that we are the church, and yet we're tied to that building so much that that heating it becomes the dominant force, and we're HVAC driven instead of presence driven, and that's not good. So Again, I don't have a solution. My solution has always been bivocational ministry. That's what I've taught for over 20 years and practiced. But I think it's a bigger issue than that. It's not just finding ways to creatively fund pastoral ministry. I think it's finding better ways to use our resources in the community and not tie them up in a furnace.
This is an issue that's really important to me, and I've spoken and written on it before. And Charisse, in her comment, pointed this out, that if we only have people who can afford to do ministry and not get paid or compensated or reimbursed for it, then we will only have people who are relatively wealthy doing ministry. And that's not what we want as a religious society of friends. Those are not the only people who are called to ministry. And I've felt this in my own life. I've spent a lot of time in unprogrammed friends, and I would get invitations to come to conferences or gatherings and speak, and I would have to pay to do ministry. I'd have to pay for travel. I would have to pay for time off work, and that's not fair. I got to a point where I was like, I am no longer going to pay to do ministry for friends. But even if you don't have to travel and you have to take time off work, that is a loss to the minister. And so this is something that's not just, whether to pay pastors. It's about making sure the people who feel called to ministry aren't paying for their own ministry.
I'd just like to bring up a historical point, looking at, say, the 19th century, particularly in England, as Quakers became quite wealthy in business. Most of the traveling ministers at that time were like the Gurneys and the Cadburys and the Peases, people who were independently wealthy, who had the time and resources to do this. We're not in that same situation now, but just to bring up a little bit from our history as how the pastoral ministries kind of developed, particularly in England and somewhat in the US too, as Quakers became wealthy. So that is part of our history.
Yeah, and I want to add, there's clearly a gender component in all of this. When I, as a male, can step into a role and work 70 or 80 hours a week, and the meeting assumes that there's essentially childcare at home. I've got somebody at home who can watch the kids, who can do all the things because I'm completely available to the meeting at any moment, day or night, have meetings 5 times a week in the evening, that sort of thing. And when the roles get shifted, and obviously I don't know this from experience, but I do know this from friends who have shared this with me, that stepping into a role where a man had been in that role for 30 or 40 years, the meeting had grown accustomed to him working 70, 80 hours a week, relying on his wife to do all of the other work. And then now this new pastor who has a family, who doesn't want to work 70 or 80 hours a week, can you imagine that? That the meeting has really struggled with adjusting, because the system it's operating out of assumes a certain kind of gender, assumes a certain kind of, whatever the things are, privileges that come along with that. And so what does it look like then to begin to rethink the culture within our meetings around who do we assume, or who does the responsibilities we have here, what does it assume of the individual, and what are the unspoken kind of requirements around time off? Is it okay to take your kid to the doctor's office in the middle of the day? Well, if it's me and my wife is at home, then that isn't an issue. If I'm a single parent, or I'm in a different situation and I'm the caretaker for that child, is there any flexibility? And so these are ways in which I think you can also, there are many other equitable issues that we can address, but this is one that I've had multiple conversations with women in ministry and some of the issues that they face.
Thanks, Wes. Any other thoughts on this question? Seems like a very urgent question. I do have, I wanted to ask both Charisse and Christy whether the chat's going to be recorded as well, because there's lots of great comments on the chat that I'd love for everyone to have time to read. There's so much being said, but it's hard to gather it all. So Christy, is the chat?
Yes, actually, I will. I'll receive a transcript of the chat, and we can package that together in some form, along with the recording of the session as well. We'll figure out how to do that. We're
great, because there's
learning.
a lot of great responses on the chat that I'd love everyone to have a chance to read. Okay, let's go to another question. What was lost with the adoption of the pastoral system in the 1860s and 70s? Is there something, if there was something lost, what needs to happen to regain what was lost today? This comes from Kevin Mortimer. And along with that line, I think he had also asked whether initially the Friends churches that adopted pastoral ministry simply just adopted the pastoral roles that were within the holiness tradition. They just adopted that wholeheartedly rather than kind of creating a kind of Quaker pastoral theology. So some responses to that question. What was lost with the adoption of the pastoral system? Did they just adopt it from the holiness movement? If there was something lost, what needs to happen to regain what was lost today? We can hear from some of historians on this question.
I'm not a historian, and that's why I'm really hesitant to say much on this question. I mean, my sense is to the first question, what was lost? You know, I'm sort of an equal opportunity Quakers losing things. So I really like, I think there's been a lot of emphasis around sort of critiquing the pastoral system. I sort of think like in that time, friends on all sides were losing things and making concessions about what they thought was most important. So, you know, so I sort of like, that's like my knee jerk. Like I want to look at it sort of more globally rather than just sort of drive down into this. But I think with, I don't think immediately anything was lost. I think now 160 years later, we can see all sorts of things were lost. And it goes back to the fact that there wasn't a stronger, more intentional apprenticing back to Quakerism. And it was, for whatever reasons, I don't fully understand, more of an adoption of holiness and Methodism and, you know, that sort of thing. And again, I don't think immediately it started out that way. I think immediately they were drawing on the folks who were in meetings, who were already traveling ministers. But as that aged, as they needed more of that, then they started to adopt a system that we would identify with the holiness movement. So it wasn't like on day one, they started ringing up holiness pastors and hiring them. That was something that emerged over time as there was more need. But so that goes back to why weren't we training and intentionally, and maybe that was because friends felt ashamed, or they didn't, like, you know, there was so much contention around it that they didn't say like, look, you know what, I mean, Hicksites over here, they're innovating just as much as we are. Why, you know, like this is, we are all following the seed as we understand it. And so that's sort of why, for me anyways, I would rather just sort of accept that there were friends who were being faithful in all of these different branches, and they were trying to be faithful to the seed. And so where can we sort of pick up and do our part to continue in faithfulness? So that, I guess that's my semi-historical comment.
I think that's pretty accurate, Wes. I think one other thing that happened was that some of these new pastoral congregations identified more closely with the national holiness movement than they did with the Quaker tradition. And that kind of, because of that, they drifted away. So that did happen as well. But I think there were probably other meetings that tried to create, you know, their own kind of Quaker pastoral ministry. So I think both things were happening at the same time. Yeah. Anyone else want to weigh in? Not necessarily even the panelists, but others that are here can certainly weigh in. Oh, there's a lot of responses on the chat. I can't keep up with them all.
Carole, could I contribute here?
Sure. Yes, please do.
Yeah, thanks so much. And I think this goes back also to Maddie's question about how to be good sheep. One thing that I think sometimes is lost with the pastoral system is that people depend on a pastor. And yet the role of the pastor is to point people to Christ. And so that's just, I mean, that's also just good pastoral ministry, to point people to Christ. And actually, it's the ministry of every person to point people to the way, the truth, and the life. I think that some of the things that were also lost, obviously, is creating space in which to listen to the present voice of Christ. So sometimes you have with expressive worship, and all of its strengths, sometimes that diminishes impressive worship, or creating space in which to engage and to respond to the work of the present Christ among us. There's a lot going on in the 19th century in terms of social concerns and justice concerns. I mean, you think of the Civil War and the huge travesty that produced for people. And so there was a real social ministry happening within the revivalist movement, inviting people to begin again and to confess personal sins, but also the sins of the nation, and try to live in more just and righteous ways. So in that sense, Quaker traveling ministry, which does relate to an earlier question about apostolic ministry and also evangelism and those kinds of other gifts that Paul mentions in Ephesians 4. By the way, in Ephesians 4:11, Paul mentions pastor and teacher as two gifts that are together, or as Elton Trueblood would say, those are the same gift. And so, as well as pastoring, you're also called to be teaching, and that's part of what requires some preparation. You look at the founding of Earlham College. You look at then later on Cleveland Bible Institute, which was the basis for Malone. You look at Friends Bible College, the basis of Berkeley College. These were schools preparing people to do Christian ministry, as well as many of the other Quaker colleges. Anyway, so yeah, part of Friends within the revivalist tradition. You've got Quakers cooperating with Methodists and others in the healing of the nation. One great thing that happened through revivalism is actual growth of Friends. And so the creating of new meetings throughout the Midwest and even into the Western states. And then that led to the Friends missionary movements over the last century, which has been the singular most significant factor in Quaker growth around the world. So these are all factors of moving towards a pastoral system. But with Wess, I think that we can really still hold on to a theology and praxis of, hey, let's open our lives to Christ. And in that sense, even open worship or silence after the manner of friends can be a corporate altar call in which all of us are doing business with God, not just those who might go up and ask for prayer. So I think that could be a way of recovering a sense of that Quaker vitality, even within the revivalist tradition. Thanks.
Thanks, Paul. I think a lot more could be said about the gender issue. There were lots of, I think the very first Quaker pastor actually was a woman. I think it was Esther Frame. And there have been many Quaker women pastors, probably more in the 19th century than today, maybe. And there have been women superintendents, certainly within my own yearly meeting, we've had several. So yeah, I want to change the trajectory a little. I've had requests from me to read Oscar's response, so he has a voice in this since his audio isn't working so well. And this is his response. He says, sorry about the lapse. Professionalism influences the pastoral role and embodiment of pastoral ministry, especially in its connection to receiving a salary. And because he's talking about in Kenya, which is somewhat different than here. Being a pastor becomes a way of earning a living, which if care is not taken, anyone can choose to be a pastor. So that's the context of Kenyan and African yearly meetings. So thank you, Oscar. I wish your audio was clear. We could hear more from you because that's really important for us to hear from Kenya, where there are more Quakers than in the United States. Okay, let's see. I think we've answered the questions that have been given to me. I know that there was a question we were talking about how we can actually do Quaker worship during this pandemic, and there's been a lot of experimentations with using Zoom. And I think it was Paul was asking if some folks could talk about how they've been doing that. And I know at Reedwood Friends meeting, which is mine, that we have been doing lots of Zoom meetings. I know other meetings have as well. And maybe Mark Kondo, our pastor at Reedwood, would like to weigh in on that and share a bit about how we've been doing Quaker worship on Zoom with a pastoral presence. Mark, are you here? I hope you're still here. And can you respond?
Yeah, I'm here.
Great.
Good to see everyone here. And I see familiar faces and new faces. And I see faces with names that I'm familiar with, but it's great to see everyone here. The way that Reedwood has been, Reedwood is constantly in a state of like experimentation. And I like this approach of like constantly asking how we can, improve, how we can do things better. And that really comes about with my relationship with the elders and my relationship with the meeting itself. So we're always kind of asking the question, okay, that was good, but how do we improve? And this approach of flexibility and improvisation, and so just kind of staying objective, staying curious, and allowing us to experiment. It reminds me of kind of the approach the Beatles took in music making. Every album of the Beatles was different because they weren't afraid to experiment. And so I've said that about Reedwood. We're not afraid to experiment with how things are going. This has just been a strange and unique and very memorable year to be a pastor. One, with the pandemic, and two, being new. I'm still new to Reedwood, and now it's at a point where we've been in this pandemic longer than I was just on site, so to speak. So it has just been this dynamic way, you know, this dynamic process of figuring it out. But more specifically of how Reedwood has been trying to implement open worship and worship after the manner of friends. I do, you know, there is a prepared message, but then we enter into a time of expectant worship. And what we have found is really to cue people and invite participation with the people that are viewing, in saying, don't assume anything. Don't assume that people are going to, you know, to act, but, you know, kind of encourage, if you want to speak, make sure you're not muted. Say your name, and if you have an opening, please share that, and by that way of encouragement, and by that way of really trying to huddle the meeting in, we've had some success there with openings and with vocal ministry, just creating an atmosphere that can be as encouraging and welcoming and participatory as you're able to do, and even kind of preaching that way, preaching in such a way where, okay, you're setting it up so it's not just you're kind of giving a perspective or giving what you've been given, me speaking for myself as a pastor, but also trying to weave into the message an expectation for the people to share. And anytime that they're sharing, I know that there is, you come away from that meeting kind of with a, you know, we feel like we've taken a breath. You know, we have some renewal, some encouragement, and so I've seen that take place with our meetings there at Reedwood. Not every week, and I don't mean to, you know, I don't mean to speak too much in ideals, but there have been motions of God among us, and I am continue to be encouraged. I'm talking too long, but just those are some thoughts.
Thanks, Mark. Appreciate that. Christy, do we have some other questions that we need to respond to?
I'd actually like to respond to the online worship question.
Great, good. Thank you, Ashley.
Yeah, because this year has been kind of a godsend for me in terms of being able to worship in different places. So I live in Atlanta currently, and where I would love to be is at Friendship Friends Meeting in Greensboro, North Carolina. And I've been able to worship with them since April. And that's been so good for me. And I'm not the only one. People are coming from different states and even other continents to worship with this community. And so that's really fed me this year. And I think we're seeing a lot of that, of people not being restricted by their physical location and where they can worship. And so much of what we do as friends is geographically sorted, and that's just not true right now. And I've had opportunities to preach in other places without, you know, leaving my desk. I've preached at Camus Friends, and next Sunday I'll be preaching at First Friends in Richmond, and I can do that from right here and not have to travel or go anywhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Ashley. That's definitely been the silver lining in our gatherings as well, as we have people drop in from all over. And some people who regularly, like we have someone from Texas that meets with us every week. And, you know, that wouldn't have been possible before. So thank you. Okay, there is one question. This perhaps may be our last question. This comes from Joseph Pfeiffer. Can entanglements of money also constrain pastors, that is keeping the contributors happy, or others that are in charge of employment opportunities? In other words, a hierarchy. Has our pastoral system turned into an unofficial patronage system at many levels? Is it a patronage system? What do you think about that? Thoughts?
I mean, I think it can be. I think that there's, you exchange a certain amount of freedom in order for the security of, you know, a paycheck and health insurance and all this stuff. And so like a pastoral meeting calls a pastor and pays them and expects them to do certain things, and that may limit what they feel like they can do or say. And so for me, you know, most of my money comes from outside of Quakers. And I find, you know, Disciples of Christ and Methodists pay a lot better than Quakers do. And then I have the freedom to say what I want when I go different places. But it is that exchange of security for freedom.
So does it constrain the prophetic message? You know, pastors can be fired.
This is where I like to talk about the, there was an old cartoon in probably Leadership Journal or something like that, of the pastor standing in the pulpit with a couple of suitcases next to him and saying, I've been meaning to talk about this for some time now. But I really think that should be an attitude that we have as pastors, that, you know, our bags need to be accessible so that we can pack them if necessary, because, you know, sometimes we have to say or do that which is not going to keep us in our job. It's one of the reasons why I've long been an advocate of bivocationalism, because if we have something else to fall back on, then we're free to minister as we're called to.
I mean, this is what I was part of what I was trying to get at with the revolutionary faithfulness, and that our faithfulness as ministers and as friends, I mean, whether we're in paid positions or not, should be to the inward teacher, should be to the present Christ. And look, I've lost jobs from colleges for being prophetic, not from churches. Okay, so I mean, this can happen anywhere and in any job, any position where you are led to speak truthfully, to challenge a decision that is made. In late capitalism, that's grounds for being fired, you know, because most of us work in places where there's no labor rights, it's right to work. They can get rid of you for any reason without any explanation. So the goal of the Quaker life, regardless of role, is to be faithful to the present teacher. And that means we are always at risk for losing our jobs and our I mean, that is always a possibility. And look, I mean, we have 350 years of stories that say that. We've got the first generation of Quakers. There were as many Quakers in jail as there were Quakers who were not, for very similar reasons, and they weren't pulling in incomes when that was happening. I mean, you know, so I really do think, like, we are in a prophetic tradition. We are in a tradition that started in resistance to the religion of empire. So if we want to be faithful to that message, we're always going to be at risk. And I think that's what we're called to do. And I would love to see that be developed and redeveloped within not just pastoral Quakerism, but in all of Quakerism.
Any other thoughts on this question from the panelists or from the audience? There's lots of responses on the chat, so you can hopefully take time to read them afterwards. There is another readout from Oscar. I want to make sure Oscar gets to share his voice. This is about professionalism question. He says, calling is primary in serving as a pastor. Volunteering or professionalism is secondary. So in either way, it depends on the choice made, which should not hinder the embodiment of pastoral ministry. Thanks for that reminder, Oscar. So Christy, do we have other questions or should we wrap up? Some people have had to leave, so we are down to fewer folks. We've been doing this for almost 2.5 hours, which is a long time to do Zoom. Zoom fatigue sets in after a while. So I think it might be time to wrap up unless someone has some parting words for us.
So I see a question / comment from Bethany Lee in the chat.
Okay.
She said, in her experience, the roles get divvied up along gender lines. Women are so often some of the secret ministers who do the practical work of caregiving, often without recognition or support, financial or otherwise. And I think this is an important thing to lift up, that we do end up with gendered roles within our Quaker meetings, as much as we try not to, and as much as we believe that we are equal. And I've found that for myself. Like, I've been in multiple meetings where they asked if I wanted to help with childcare because I am a younger woman, and that is just assumed to be one of my gifts, but it is not. And so I think it is important to pay attention to who we're asking to do which roles, how those might be gendered, and who we're paying for things, and whether we're paying people different amounts or we're paying certain people more than others.
Good point. Thanks, Ash.
I just want to comment that I come from the unprogrammed tradition, and this has been exceedingly interesting and informative for me, since I have never been part of a meeting with a pastor or paid clergy, and to hear what these traditions and things are has been somewhat surprising. And I was actually beginning to wonder if this is not another issue where friends are over intellectualizing or overthinking things, which we have a really bad habit of doing in many areas.
Thank you, Carter. Haven't met you before, but I appreciate hearing your voice from the unprogrammed tradition. So thank you so much. I see Matt Boswell has a long chat here. We haven't heard from Matt. Do you want to say a few words to us? As someone who came to the Quaker tradition from outside the tradition and now pastoring in a friend's meeting. Are you there, Matt?
Matt said he can't because his kids are yelling in the background.
Oh, okay. Well, you'll have to read his chat then. Yeah. Oh, yeah, there he is. Yeah. His kids yelling. Well, see, that happens. Life interferes.
But that issue of trust that he brings up is really important, of the trust between the congregation and the pastor that they release. And so that building up of trust allows the pastor to become able to be more prophetic, perhaps, in their messages and the ways that they lead the congregation. If the congregation trusts them to lead in a direction that is spirit-led, then as that relationship is built up, then the whole congregation can follow that lead more effectively if the pastor is being worthy of that trust and staying in the heart of their prophetic ministry. So thanks for bringing that word, Matt.
Yeah, thanks. And I'm reminded of the early Quakers, particularly the women who often had many children at home, and they would leave for 2-3 years at a time. and the meetings would take care of their families. That's not something that we do so much today. But you know, times have changed, but it's always been an issue. And the community is so important to being a part of the ministry in so many ways. Well, I think at this point, it's probably about time. We have one final minute. Really appreciate all the panelists for all the insights they've brought to us, and also for some of the amazing conversations that are going on in the chat. That will be very exciting to read after we have more time to do that. And again, these are recorded, so they can be reviewed if you want to hear again, maybe some things that you missed. The one thing about Zoom is you're looking at the chats and you're listening, and you have to multitask continually, which is, I think, why people get Zoom fatigue. So thank you also